Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. I'm here today with Bruce Boyce, aka Pharmaceutical Whistleblower. Bruce, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, look, you came out with a book recently that I think is going to set quite a bit on fire. I think it is so important that everybody kind of understand what happened throughout this country with pharmaceuticals, with the opioid epidemic. You're an expert in all of that because you were right there in the guts, in the belly of what occurred. All right, Bruce, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
I was born and raised in the Midwest, and I went to school to Ohio State University and then worked in pharmaceuticals. And I was a rep and a manager and did real well for about 24 years.
Now, so in other words, you were into the guts of the pharmaceutical companies. You understood how it worked both externally and what about things like research and development? Were you involved there sort of to give guidance to the people in that department, what the people on the outside were looking for, hoping for, etc.?
No, I wasn't part of the research end of the pharmaceutical industry. It was mostly in the sales division. As a sales rep and hospital rep, and also as a area manager or district manager.
Okay. Now, you went through quite a bit. What inspired you to write the book at the time, at this time, relative to when you actually became that whistleblower?
Well, the reason why the book was written now is because there were actually two cases. There was a case that started in 2003, and there was a case that was in 2008. And so it took like 14 years total for all that to take place. And obviously I couldn't write a book while that was going on. And I really wrote the book because, one, I think it's important for people to understand what a whistleblower goes through, what they can expect, how difficult that can be, and also because of the opioid crisis. When I first started as a whistleblower, it wasn't that I was doing it as a whistleblower. I was afraid people were going to die. I was afraid that people were going to overdose. Those issues I just couldn't deal with on my watch. I just couldn't handle it and deal with that on my watch. So what I did is that's why I started to be an undercover informant for the feds. And it wasn't until a nurse called me and said, "Oh, you can do something about it." And I'm going, "I can?" And she goes, "Yeah, would you talk to somebody in the federal government?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I will." I just sort of threw it off. "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." And that's when I got a hold of, it was first the FBI and then Office of Criminal Investigation. And that's when I started WareWire to investigate the company.
I am so glad that you expressed it that way, because there are a lot of people out there, a lot of reps out there. They don't care about the results of what they're doing. They simply do it because the cash flow is great. And you're telling me that as you were doing this and realized what you're being pushed to do, that is sell these drugs for the purposes that they weren't necessarily prescribed for. I think this is when you worked for the company called Cephalon. Is that correct?
Right. Correct.
So when you were, I think you were actually pushed to sell these drugs for whatever purposes, you just needed to get numbers out there. Is that right?
Exactly right. What occurs is that in the industry, you wind up having an orphan drug. An orphan drug is described as a drug that has a real small market area. And so it, like narcolepsy, has 130 patients in the country. So after you get the first year, you've saturated the market, you've taken 80% of the market. What do you do to the second year? Well, you go off label is what you do with the drug. And so what they did is that they decided to go off label on all three drugs all the time. And they were just looking for an indication that would work for them, and then expect the federal government not to catch up with it for 10 years.
Well, I want to get into a little bit of a moral issue with you a little bit further, but before, let's go through some technicalities. You decided that you could do that no more. You couldn't stand the deaths that were occurring or the illnesses that given these prescriptions would affect. So you decided finally to go to the feds.
Correct.
You wore a wire for how long?
And not quite 2 years.
Two.
And that's what
Wow.
I worked with federal agents for almost 2 years. And the reason for that, Alberto, is that it was a situation where I was afraid that the Justice Department, they weren't going to pick up the case. And so I kept trying to get evidence about what the company was doing and how they were going about the fraud. And it took a long time to pick that information up.
So all this time that you were wearing this wire, were you going into work every single day with the wire, or?
No, I was wired for the national meeting, and then I was wired for other conversations later in the year. And then when I said I would work, it wasn't that I worked with them like all the time wearing a wire. It's documentation, getting witnesses to step forward for the government to talk to. It was arranging those kind of scenarios like for literally almost 2 years.
How many people within the company knew that you were actually whistleblowing?
It wasn't until I got fired. And it was during the bust, the FDA bust on the national meeting. And that's when they suspected me. And 6 months later, I was gone.
Oh, they did. So they did suspect you before they actually knew for sure that you were the whistleblower.
That they suspected, and they got rid of me. And then they blackballed me. So I was actually doing interviews to find another job because I thought I would just turn over documentation, wear the wire, and show the fraud and the greed that was going on, and then I can move on with my life. No, it doesn't work that way.
Well,
you fall a long way.
Let me tell you, for somebody who studies what our corporatocracy, specifically the pharmaceutical industry, does, I tell you what, it is no surprise to me. But let's go ahead and why don't you tell me a little bit of the tribulations that you went through after? Because I mean, it always seemed to turn out that the person doing good, they take a steep drop for a while. In other words, they pay a penalty for doing good, something that I thought the whistleblower law was supposed to mitigate. So tell our audience some of the tribulations that you've been through.
Sure, and you have a great question, and I think the misconception is under the False Claims Act, the whistleblower is usually protected. There's a section H that's involved that talks about loss of income. So if the whistleblower is fired, there is trouble damages, which is 3 times damages a lot of times. The issue with that is that that's not till the end of the case. So how do you protect the whistleblower in the most vulnerable period of time? And one of the things that my lead counsel in the first case we've tried to do before is to try to pool other whistleblowers together to help them financially so that they're able to keep going and able to do their case. The section H that I talk about is only either after the case is dismissed or after the case is successful. That's where the hands off, you can't touch this person. Well, most of the time that's not true. Most of the time the company goes after the person like they did myself, and not only just fire me, but actually call prospective employers and try to keep you from being employed in the industry.
Now, how did you document that?
I had people that heard conversations of the individual that did it and reported back to me saying, when you went to this meeting, I was going to be director of training for this company. And I had packed to go to Arizona to wind up be the director and be introduced as the director of training. And in 5 minutes, there was a conversation off in another room, and they came in and they said, "Oh, we're having you escorted out of the building right now. Pack your things up." And I was gone.
While you were in Arizona already?
While I was in San Diego interviewing, and it was just a handshake. That it was just a handshake. I was hired already, basically. And I had packed for another week to be the director of training and go to a national sales meeting. And I was escorted out of the building. And I'm standing there, my head was spinning, and I had to call and get a cab and go to the airport.
And they told you no more. That's it.
That's it. And after that, what happens is that once the word gets out, and this is what, they're saying to other people, you're not going to get a job. Your resume looks weird. Why do you have these gaps? I was a high flyer with making great money, being promoted. And then all of a sudden you're not able to get a job. Why can't you get a job? See, and then it's tough. I'm not I don't lie very well. It's on my face.
Well,
so it really fell apart quick.
Well, that is pretty darn. First of all, that is heroic. Okay, anybody that has the pelotas to go against the pharmaceutical company, they have my respect. And the reason why is that institution. I mean, I find it. I'm happy to speak to somebody who worked within the industry, saw what's going on, and said, you know what, we need to do something to mitigate it. But some of what you're telling me here, when you explain to us about drugs that become not phantom drugs, what do you call them?
Orphan drugs.
Orphan drugs, when they become orphan drugs. What you're pretty much telling me is that the commercial side of the pharmaceutical company is just that. It has nothing to do with health. It's just using drugs as a source, as the widget from which to make profits for folks. So when you hear all these stories about the reason we're charging all these exorbitant prices for drugs, or the reason we want these types of freedoms to move these drugs, it has nothing to do with research and development. One of the reasons I first asked you if your interface you are a perfect interface between the doctors, the people who are using your product, and research and development, because well, they are no longer needing this. This is sort of what they would like to have. That is information research R&D would want. The fact that you are not in the R&D chain says much about what do you think about that?
I'm going to give you an example of just what you're talking about. In the first case, there was a drug called Provigil. Mm-hmm. It was for narcolepsy. It was for excessive daytime sleepiness and narcolepsy. What the company did, they knew they were going to get caught for the first case for fraud. So they made a drug called Nuvigil. So they just changed some atoms around and moved some covalent bonds. And it was this similar drug, just a different name. They got a different NDA number on it. And so finally what they did is that they did a switch campaign. And so they switched patients that were off-label marketed patients for Provigil to off-label marketed patients for Nuvigil to get around the government. They did the same thing with Actic. Actic is a fentanyl, and they created a drug called Fentora. And so they did a switch campaign. It went from Actic to Fentora, and it's a Schedule II item. If you've got people that are drug naive and you put them on it, you have a risk of overdose with that drug. And they marketed it to migraine patients. So that just gives you an idea. And why? Why did they do this? Greed. They made billions of dollars out of it. That's why.
Now, explain the complicity then between the pharmaceutical companies and, let's say, the FDA and the other enforcement agencies.
I think if you want to look at blame, yeah, you're looking at the pharmaceutical company or the pharmaceutical companies. There's several that really started the opioid epidemic. Okay, you've got really several that, like for example, at OxyContin, you got Purdue, you got Cephalon with Actic, you've got Johnson & Johnson with Duragesic. So those are the ones that actually started it. But the blame can go around to a lot of people. The FDA could have stopped Cephalon from promoting a fentanyl product that was supposed to be used in a hospital with patients that were cancer patients that had breakthrough pain that were dying. They were terminally ill. So fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. It's 50 times more potent than heroin. And so you're having a drug that you're prescribing as somebody that's not used to an opioid, you're going to be in real trouble real fast with that. And the company didn't care. It was going to make a lot of money. That was the whole purpose of it.
And that is always the purpose of it. I mean, they like to say many times, the pharmaceuticals, we have to do this because we have to invest in R&D. You're telling me that they have to do this in order for you to get a commission, but not only for you to get a commission, but for the higher ups to make a killing off of not necessarily anything good for the consumer.
Well, I think one of the things I try to do with launching of the book is also to show patient advocacy. What can patients do? How can they arm themselves? Forewarned is forearmed, right? So what do you need to do when a doctor writes a script for you and you're unsure what that's for and the indication? Because you can have an on-label indication and you can have an off-label indication. Off-label indication by a physician is fine if it's appropriately done. The trouble is
wait, let me back up. You're telling me that it is in fact legal for a doctor to use a medicine off-label, but it's illegal for you as the rep to promote that medicine for off-label use. Am I understanding what you're saying?
That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So what you've got is that you've got a doctor that, let's say, has several patients in his practice or her practice that are not doing very well. And you've got a drug that comes along and the doctor has every legal right to turn around and try to help that patient by prescribing a drug that may be off-label or not indicated by the FDA. They're able to do that by law. Then they take a risk, okay?
And what is the risk? That they get sued if it's the counterindication is wrong, or?
Well, there's a lot of other things that can happen with that. You don't know, maybe you don't know what the dose is. You don't know the safety profile, the side effect profile. You know, you got a side effect complex that is, they don't know what exactly it is. It's an unsure drug. They don't have data on it that helps them understand better what the drug is. But most of the time, physicians are really good at that. They know what the drug is supposed to do. They know the side effects profile. And so they're pretty comfortable in an off-label script. That's okay. But a rep coming in and a manager coming in, telling a doctor, this is what you have to write for off-label is illegal.
I got you. You know, let me tell you something, Bruce. I think one of the importance of your book is not only about you being a whistleblower and the tribulations that you went through, but I think empowering people to, like you mentioned earlier, when they get the script from the doctor, understanding how these things can affect them, but more importantly, to sort of take the veil off a lot of the narrative that we hear from the industry every day on commercials and ads on the pharmaceutical companies, to let folks understand that it's no more than just we all know that many of these guys, many of the pharmaceutical companies, their R&D originated in colleges and universities. And
Correct.
Then they take it and turn it into marketing. And I think one of the things that you are showing is how much of it, I mean, you don't mind them taking this over and doing more research, taking it over and doing more testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But from what you're saying, it is the overbearing arch is towards marketing. Why don't you kind of expand on that?
There's a term in pharmaceuticals called Me Too. It's a Me Too drug. And so a Me Too drug is the Provigil to Nuvigil. The Nuvigil is a Me Too. All it is just a different chemical composition, but it's really the same drug. And so all they do is that they up the price. They make the other drug a generic. They make money on the generic, and they make money on the new brand drug. And so what you get is that you get this factory, this wheels are spinning and they're making money, but the patient doesn't benefit much from the new drug. And that's where the issue that all the money is going to R&D and we need this absorbent amount per year of 400 billion per year is what they make. So you know that some of that money goes to, like the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association was lobbyist, to the lobbyist people. And why is that? Because they grease the skids with everything else. And it's like, that's when I said to you that, you know, it wasn't just the pharmaceutical company. I ran into a huge tailwind and a headwind and cross currents, that it's the FDA as well. It's the court system. It is not just one little thing that goes on here. It is a lot. It's really complicated, and I want people to pay attention. That's why the book.
And you explain all of that in detail in the book. Let me tell you, I think that it is such an important book for people to read. Now, there's a little snippet that came out in your bio that I want to go over a minute. It is interesting to see somebody who went from 6 figures to telling me you had to flip a few burgers. Tell me how you felt about that.
Oh, that's tough. I was a millionaire before.
Mm-hmm.
And I lost everything. I lost houses, cars, I lost investments, I lost everything. And I wound up, the only thing I'd get as work was to flip burgers at a carnival. And it was a friend of mine that was proud of what I did and said, look, we'll help you get through this. You know, I was riding a bicycle to like Kinko's to send an email. That's the way I could contact my legal counsel at the time. And they jumped in and said, hey, look, you know, we'll flip you on the grill and you'll be able to flip burgers. We'll give you $10 an hour. And that's how I survived through the most difficult time. But it's horrible.
Now, did the company eventually have to give you a lump sum or anything for you being right?
I wound up in the first case that it was settled, and the government fined the company $425 million, and I received net after lawyers after taxes around $6 million. And
that's good.
And that's good. I did a podcast with somebody else, and one of the comments by the host was, "That's not enough." I go, well,
I mean, you had 14 years of tribulation, right?
Right, and you don't. And look, you don't do it for the money.
Right.
And if that's why you're doing it, you're going to fail.
Right. Well, I mean, especially since you have to do it because you have the back end to do it. That is what's important. And not only that to put it bluntly, I think you would have made quite a bit more than $6 million if you had just played the game.
Oh, I was, before I started, I was making $340,000 a year.
There you go. That answers the question right there.
But you know, I just could not get past the idea of who was going to stand up for the people that were innocent, and somebody was going to overdose on these drugs, and then wind up the family members would have no idea what went wrong. The doctor wasn't going to tell, the pharmaceutical company wasn't going to tell, but they would just have an individual that was deceased, and I couldn't do that on my watch. That's why I did it.
So, well, the one good thing about that is I think folks like you have exposed that the opioid crisis didn't just start from the evil people, from people who couldn't control their drug habits or whatever. It's something that was really pushed onto them from these pharmaceutical companies to make a dollar.
Yes, I think so. I think
Bruce,
exactly.
Go ahead.
Well, I since I've been doing this, promoting the book, I also try to do patient advocacy with different agencies, because I think tackling the opioid crisis is a multi-organizational approach. And so, but I talk about that, and as I talk about that, I meet people, and my barber talked about her mom that died, and it wasn't an overdose. She was going to a pain care center, and the pain care center doc was keeping her alive, and she died because her organs were destroyed. So there's a lot of collateral damage, and there's a big need to try to help people with this.
Well, look, I think your presence here will empower a lot of people who are really doing it for the right reasons where they can to do it. I sure hope we have a whole lot more in the pharmaceutical industry. I remember the transition from Claritin to Clarinex when Claritin came off patent. I can tell you story after story after story about that as well. What would you have liked me to ask you that I didn't?
My website, if people want more information, is Boise, BOISE.com.
Bruce, thank you so kindly for the interview. All the information about your book, your website will be a part of our postings. and we'll be hearing you all over the place. So thank you so kindly, and thank you for what you've done. I think more people need to step up and do what you're doing, because unless that happens, we're going to continue to have this, not only in the pharmaceutical industries, but in various other industries where the only thing that matters to many of these, the corporatocracy, is the dollar bill. To hell with anything else, to hell with humanity. Thank you so kindly, Bruce, for being with us.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'm Egberto Willies, host of Politics Done Right, an independent news program. I post several news videos of interest every day. I ask you so kindly to subscribe to my channel, and please leave me some comments. Thank you very much.